Hey guys, Tim asked me to talk to you today about tithing, which I'm sure is a really exciting topic for everyone to listen to. But it's an important one. It's part of the daily life of the church and also part of the daily life of being a disciple of Jesus. So when we think about tithing, I think the first place to start is to think broadly and to think of what Paul writes in Romans 12, where he says each and every one of us are living sacrifices. Now, when we think of us being living sacrifices, the question I have when I read that text is like, okay, that sounds great, Pastor Joel, wonderful, we're living sacrifices, but where is my altar? I mean, if we're sacrifices, and we're living sacrifices, where is our altar? And I think a lot of times we tend to think that, well, our altar is where we go give things to God, right? I mean, an altar in the Old Testament, that is what it was, is you would go to the temple and you would have this altar laid out. And I have a picture of what an altar would have looked like from the side here in the Old Testament, made out of bricks, right? And then it had the horns on the edges there, on the altar, on four corners. On each corner you had those horns. And of course, if you were seeking refuge from someone was trying to kill you, you could run to the altar and grab onto the horns, and then you would have to be safe. I know Adonijah did this when he was trying to, he wanted to save his life from Absalom, who was trying to kill him. So that's the altar, right? And so we often think, well, altar in the Old Testament is where people went to make sacrifices, and it usually is at the temple. And so I think sometimes we think our altar would then be the church. So we come to the church and then we give sacrifices at the church, right? Sometimes we talk very cliche, like sacrifices of praise, right? We sing songs and then we give our money at the church. But I'm going to tell you right now, I think this is the wrong idea. This is not at all what the altar is. Our altar, I'm going to suggest to you, is not church or not anything at church. If we're living sacrifices, our altar is our life itself. This is our altar on which we live. So, and I get this idea from the book of Leviticus. In the book of Leviticus, there is this strange kind of law or regulation, which tells God's people that when they have a field and they're growing crops on it, they are not to harvest the corners of their field. They're not supposed to do that. And in fact, they're not supposed to do that because God commands it. And the reason for this is that when you don't harvest the corners of your field, then those who are poor, those who are needy and hungry, can come and harvest that remainder, right? So if you look at a field, and let's look at a field from a kind of top-down perspective, most fields in those days would have been squared off like this. And so, if you're looking from the top down and you're supposed to leave the corners without being harvested, you'd have corners looking like this. Right? Just like that. So you're looking down onto a field like from sky view, like if you were on a drone looking down, right? And so you would leave the corners unharvested. Now, interesting, this is exactly how Boaz and Ruth met, because Boaz had a field and then he wouldn't harvest the corners, so that people who are poor, like Ruth, could come and harvest it for themselves. And that's exactly what she did. She would come and harvest and whatnot. Now, the interesting thing about this is your fields are visible to everyone. Everyone who walks by can see exactly how big of a corner you leave up. Because it's interesting, Leviticus never says how big the corners of your field have to be. If you want, you could have a really tiny corner, I guess. You just don't harvest this part. But everyone would see it, and everyone would know your righteousness or lack thereof. Or you could have a big corner, and then it would be seen to everyone. Now, why was Ruth at Boaz's field? Probably because his corners are pretty big, right? He was giving a lot up. So that would be the field to go to. So this is, so in other words, the field is a visible thing, and our lives are a visible thing. People can see us. They can see what we give of our life, and if we're living sacrifices, they can see what we do with it. And we all tithe something in our life. I love to read books. So over the course of last year alone, I think I listened to about 60 to 70 audiobooks, and that doesn't count the books I actually read, right? That's hours and hours and hours of my time I tithed to reading. We all do this. We all have things we give our life to, right? And some of these things are fine. And what God wants to know is, okay, if this field is your life and people can see it and people can see you, what are the corners that they're noticing that stand out, that you're giving to Him, that you're giving to other people? Now, here's a really interesting thing, and I'm going to write this here. Here's the word for for life in Hebrew. Avodah. That's your life. Now, we're living sacrifices, and the word for life in Hebrew is avodah. But guess what the word for work is in Hebrew? Avodah. So the word for worship, not life, I said life. The word for worship in Hebrew is avodah. The word for work in Hebrew is avodah. So your life and your worship are the same word. In other words, your entire life is worship and all your work is worship. It's all God's. And how much of this are we going to give to God? So one thing I want to point out, though, is if you've got an altar, you've got the four horns, and now imagine what this altar would look like if you looked at it top down. If you had a horn at each corner, it'd look like a field with its corners. So the field of your life, how you live your life, is your altar. And the question you have to ask then when it comes to tithing, when it comes to anything like this, is how big do you want your corners to be? Because all of your field, all of your life is God's, and how you live your life is worship. So I'm not going to sit here and give you a magic number, like how much should I tithe? Should it be 10%? 10% of gross, 10% of net. I mean, I'm not going to come and give you that formula. In fact, the Bible doesn't give it. This is what the image the Bible gives. It's like, hey, how much are you willing to recognize that all your life is God's? And if all your life is God's, can you trust Him enough to make your corners big? That's the question we're tithing and thinking about. And when you go with them, and this, by the way, is not something you have to wait for when you're older and have an income and have a career and have a job. You already have resources. You already have time. You're already making decisions in your daily life what you can give your life to. I give a lot of my time to reading. What do you give yours to? Right? So our tithing isn't just money. It is money, but it's other things too. And if this is our life is our altar, the question we have to ask then is how much of this altar that is our life are we going to give to God?